Okay, so this is the second part of the autonomic video lecture going over the second part of chapter 15. And when we left off before, we were talking about the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic system. So we need to go over the sympathetic branch of the autonomic system. So remember, all the autonomic systems, the branches are all considered visceral motor neurons. The preganglionic neurons are found within the central nervous system, particularly within the thoracic region, T1 through L2. And then as they leave the central nervous system, the postganglionic neuron is found close to the spinal cord, and they are often branched like I've drawn here. So remember, sympathetic is considered the fight or flight branch, whereas parasympathetic is rest and digest. Okay, so we got our preganglionic neuron going through the central nervous system and then out into the periphery. And remember that we release in a neurotransmitter here, and the receptor for it is found on the postganglionic neuron. And the neurotransmitter it releases within the synapse is acetylcholine. It's acetylcholine. And the receptors for acetylcholine are nicotinic receptors. Then as we travel down the second neuron, the postganglionic neuron, it releases a neurotransmitter, either epinephrine or norepinephrine. And the receptors for epinephrine or norepinephrine are what are called adrenergic receptors. And we have two flavors of those. They're either alpha or beta. And typically for those, alpha adrenergic receptors are typically considered to be stimulatory. So they stimulate whatever the effector may be. So in this case, it's the heart. And then typically beta adrenergic receptors inhibit. However, when it comes to the heart, beta receptors tend to stimulate rather than inhibit. So in this instance, I have the heart, and so beta receptors would actually cause stimulation instead of inhibition. So you've probably heard of the drug, a beta blocker. And a beta blocker is given for people with high blood pressure. So you would imagine that the beta blocker, the receptors, are found within the heart, and when it comes to the heart, if you take a beta blocker, you're trying to reduce blood pressure, and to do that, you block these beta receptors that are considered stimulatory within the heart. However, in other places, they're inhibitory. Okay, so make sure that you make note of that there is an exception for a beta adrenergic receptor. So, with your sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, remember these are all visceral motors. This is fight or flight. The preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine into the synapse. The receptors are nicotinic. And then as the action potential travels down the postganglionic neuron, it releases another neurotransmitter into the synapse, either epinephrine or norepinephrine. And the receptors found on the effector are adrenergic for these neurotransmitters, and they're either alpha or beta. So what does that look like in the spinal cord here? So the cell bodies are found for the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. They're found typically within the lateral gray horn, and they leave in this direction And then as they pass through the spinal nerve here, you'll find that they do something different. So they go through this little part right here. And then there's another cell body. And then it comes back out. And there's our adrenergic receptor. So what we have going on here is the lateral gray horn is where the cell body is within the central nervous system, and then as it leaves and then goes through the spinal nerve, remember it splits off into a anterior rami, and then this would be the posterior rami. And in the thoracic region, we have the sympathetic ganglia, a chain of sympathetic ganglion. And they, like all ganglion, they have cell bodies. And they contain these sympathetic ganglion or sympathetic cell bodies. And they synapse with the neuron coming from the lateral gray horn. And then the action potential can travel down that second neuron to the effector, which could possibly be the heart tissue, and find its adrenergic receptor. Okay? So we have one other way in which this can happen. The other way in which this can happen is through sympathetic control of the adrenal glands. So remember, the adrenal glands are found on the poles, the top poles of the kidneys. And I drew a little picture for you to sort of identify the tissue found within the adrenals. So the adrenals, like the kidneys, have a cortex and a medulla. And the cortex, the adrenal cortex, is actually endocrine tissue and produces things like steroid hormones like aldosterone. And the adrenal medulla, which is the inner region, is what is actually going to produce things like epinephrine. Okay? So how does sympathetic control of the adrenal glands work? So we have our cell body found within the central nervous system here. And it works like just before. It's going to send an action potential out into the peripheral nervous system, release a neurotransmitter, acetylcholine. But instead of having an actual postganglionic neuron, the cell body of what would be the postganglionic neuron is actually found within the adrenal medulla. It's actually found within the adrenal medulla. And the receptors for acetylcholine, remember, will have nicotinic receptors and also muscarinic receptors. And then from there, it causes a release of epinephrine, and instead of it going through the nervous system, it gets dumped directly into the blood and can travel to target tissue that way and flood the system with epinephrine. Okay, so here the postganglionic neuron cell body has no axon and is actually within the adrenal medulla. Okay, so going back to that previous picture, I just want to make note that the hypothalamus, the master controller, is actually helping to maintain this whole system, this whole sympathetic system. Okay. Oh, here I have a picture of a cadaver picture, and we can see the spinal cord here. And coming from the spinal cord, we can actually see some sympathetic ganglion. So sympathetic chain ganglion coming off of the spinal cord here. And so this is what it would look like in a cadaver. So remember, those are collections of cell bodies, the second or the postganglionic cell bodies, sympathetic ganglion. Okay. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is an example of an autonomic reflex. And the example I want to use is your pupil dilation and constriction. You're familiar with the optic nerve, where it's at, and the fact that it can control your pupil constricting or dilating. So two terms that we need to be familiar with are ipsilateral and contralateral. So ipsilateral refers to when the stimulus and the response happen just on the same side of the body, whereas contralateral refers to when the stimulus and the response can happen on different sides of the body. And we have two examples. There's pupillary light reflex, which is ipsilateral. And the example we're going to do is consensual light reflex, which is contralateral. Okay, so I've drawn here a picture of your eyes, and our stimulus is obviously going to be light. So we have light coming into our eyes. And we could have light coming either on the left side or the right side with this autonomic reflex. It wouldn't matter because it is contralateral, and we would get pupillary reflex on both sides of the face, or both the eyes. So how does this work? So remember, the optic nerve communicates with the stimulus through receptors, and those receptors are called photoreceptors. We have photoreceptors for light found within the retina of the eye. Remember, those are the rods and the cones. Okay, they're on the retina. And the optic nerve is within the back of the eye. So how does this work? So we have a sensory neuron that's going to synapse. I'll do that backwards, hold on. Within the central nervous system. Okay? And I guess I need to get a different color because we also have this on the opposite side. But here's the thing. We have some crossing over here. So not only does it happen on the right side, but it also happens on the left side. We have some crossing over. And then within the central nervous system, these were our sensory neurons, taking the information this way. Now we have some interneurons that are going to take information this way. And we actually get the opportunity to cross information again. So we have two opportunities to cross information here. And those are our interneurons within the central nervous system. So we have two opportunities to cross information from our stimulus. And then from here, remember, we're talking about an autonomic reflex. Our preganglionic neuron is going to pass into the peripheral nervous system. And remember, what would be our effector here? hopefully you said the muscles of the pupil. So the effector would be the muscles surrounding the pupil that control how much light get in and out of the eyes. And this is considered an autonomic reflex. So let me ask you, what if you just stimulated the right side, your right eye? The light still travels to both sides and will constrict both pupils. This is what we consider a consensual light reflex, called contralateral is opposite eye. And it creates this consensual pupillary reflex. And this is important for assessing certain things like brain stem function, optic nerve health. Remember, the optic nerve is cranial nerve number 2, and can also be used to evaluate barbiturate use. If somebody's using barbiturates, it will affect pupillary dilation. Okay. Now to sort of bring it together, let's review these autonomic reflexes and how they would function in the body. So comparing sympathetic versus parasympathetic. So as far as heart rate goes, sympathetic system would act to increase heart rate, whereas parasympathetic would act to decrease it. Your breathing rate, oxygen consumption would go up, whereas parasympathetic would aim to decrease breathing rate. Pupil size, sympathetic system would increase pupil size, letting in more light, and parasympathetic would decrease pupil size, constricting the pupil, letting in less light. Your digestion, sympathetic system would decrease digestion, whereas parasympathetic would increase it. And reproduction, sympathetic system actually controls climax, whereas parasympathetic is what is in control of arousal. For instance, in male reproduction, climax is considered ejaculation, whereas parasympathetic arousal would be considered erection. Okay, so we know that the nervous system is coordinated and controlled out of the central nervous system, including the brain and the spinal cord. The boss of all of this is the hypothalamus. And it maintains homeostasis throughout this whole thing. And it uses the limbic lobe for emotional input in the cerebral cortex, particularly the frontal lobe, to communicate at the subconscious level. Okay. Now the brainstem is important for regulating things like pupil size, breathing, so respiration, heart rate, blood pressure, and also things like swallowing will be coordinated by the brainstem. Now going further down, things like urination, defecation, erection, and ejaculation. These are all coordinated particularly by the spinal cord. So we have different levels of control, meaning different autonomic reflexes are controlled by different levels of the central nervous system. But all in all, who maintains it or coordinates the overall thing, it has to do with the hypothalamus. Okay. So the last thing that I want to talk about is sympathetic tone, and then the difference between localized and diffuse effects. So your sympathetic division controls blood pressure and keeps vessels in a somewhat continual state of partial constriction. And this is what we call sympathetic tone or vasomotor tone. It constricts blood vessels and causes blood pressure to rise as needed. It prompts vessels to dilate if blood pressure is then too low. So for instance, you think of a hose. If this is a blood vessel or a hose and it senses that we have a pressure of 20, which is too low, then it would constrict and cause the pressure to go up, or vice versa. If it was 40 and too high, then it would then dilate. And this is what is called sympathetic tone. They act to, your sympathetic exerts long-lasting or diffuse effects. So your sympathetic nervous system has longer lasting than parasympathetic autonomic nervous system and is more diffuse. So parasympathetic is short-lived and highly localized. So for example, your parasympathetic system acts on things like digestion, defecation, diuresis, which is getting rid of fluid, whereas their sympathetic system is longer lasting and acts on things like your muscles, your heart, your lungs, and other things like that related to bigger organ systems like that that affect overall physiology. Okay, so those are localized versus diffuse effects of the autonomic system. So one is more short-lived versus sympathetic, which is more longer lasting. Okay, so also know what sympathetic tone is. It constricts blood vessels and causes blood pressure to increase as needed and vice versa. All right, so that's all that I have for the second part of chapter 15, the autonomic nervous system. Happy studying.